I am the VP of Sales for PCS, and today we have put together a presentation for you on not only digital patients, but building believable ones. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle Castleberry, who is the head of content at PCS and also a former standardized patient. And she comes with a breadth of knowledge on the subject. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Nick. I wasn't anticipating that you would do such a lovely job introducing me, but I did prepare an introduction, something along the lines of good morning and afternoon, Learning Lab listeners. My name is Michelle Castleberry, and I'm your host of this Learning Lab Hour. As Nick and Olivia mentioned, I'm the co-founder of PCS Patient Communication Simulators. I'm also head of content. I oversee our clinical advisory board. And I happen to be, as Nick said, a former standardized patient, originally from McMaster University, where I started as an SP at the ripe old age of 18 months. And I wrapped up my SP career at Eastern Virginia Medical School in about 2007. Welcome to Building Believable Personas for Digital Patients. Today's lab will be broken down into 4 parts, leaving about 15 minutes for questions at the very end of the presentation, or in the rare event that there are no questions, the opportunity for you to have some time to regroup before your next Zoom meeting. So part 1 and 2, what are virtual patients, and a brief summary of the recent advancements in technology that have made it possible for this resurgence of the virtual patient to include, spoiler alert, the birth of modern day natural language processing and AI, artificial intelligence. Part 3, how our PCS, artificially intelligent virtual patient works, but don't tell anyone, let's keep that between you and I. Are there any Laerdal or CAE folks on the line? Just kidding. Finally, part 4, building personas. Our platform allows creative control and authorships over patients. We're one of the few that do this. During this part, I show you how they're built, or how myself alongside our clinical advisory board builds them. And I share some tips and tricks that we've learned along the way in building our virtual patients or our digital patients. So let's get started. Virtual patients are experiencing a second renaissance. Conceptualized in the 1970s, the modern virtual patient was born in the mid-90s and early 2000s. They were clickable multimedia experiences with various levels of interactivity. Think the menu-driven static screen patient. This is often the default definition that comes to mind when we think of virtual patients. The definition given to us by SSH is a representation of an actual patient. Virtual patients can take many forms: software-based physiological simulators, simulated patients, physical mannequins and simulators, or a second definition, which is a computer program that simulates real-life clinical scenarios in which the learner acts as a healthcare provider, obtaining a history, physical exam, making diagnostic and therapeutic decisions. In August of 2009, published in the Journal of Medical Teacher, those same authors that provided us a working definition in the previous slide, the SSH definition, Ellaway, Poulton, and Smothers, published an article titled Virtual Patients Come of Age. Am I frozen?
No, you're not frozen.
Oh, okay, sorry, I heard something come through. Virtual Patients Come of Age, and highlighted why virtual patients were increasingly forming a part of medical education mainstream.
Settings.
The reasons behind the use of virtual patients are as true today than they were over 10 years ago. Perhaps even more so with education going contactless amidst this global pandemic. Virtual patients address the administrative challenges of scalability, keeping quality high for quantity demands. Flexibility, addressing logistical challenges like
Michelle, can you pause 1 second?
Yeah, I'm getting.
I'm going to mute all, and then Michelle, unmute yourself. There we go. You should be good now.
Okay, great. And I'm a few slides ahead. Here we go. Okay, back on track. So just to recap, in 2009, there was an article published titled Virtual Patients Come of Age. Within that article, it highlighted why virtual patients were increasingly forming a part of the medical education mainstream. The reasons behind the use of virtual patients are as true today as they were over 10 years ago when that article was published, and perhaps even more so today with education going contactless amidst this global pandemic. So virtual patients address the administrative challenges of scalability. We want to keep quality high for quantity demands. Class sizes are increasing, but we want to maintain a high bar and a high level of quality. Flexibility, addressing logistical challenges like additional practice and remediation. How do you build that into an already full week or full running simulation center and program? Limited faculty or operator oversight. We see the class sizes increasing, faculty numbers seem static, sometimes we get more, but we need more availability for learners to interact. So we have limited faculty or operator oversight. In addition, if an SP program is even accessible during education, virtual patients address obstacles and gaps within SP programs themselves. Diversity of SP pools, accessibility, repeatability, budget constraints, learner and SP safety, and finally, it addresses the need where we want to maximize SP time. SPs become more available for advanced cases and skills when these virtual patients help with the novice learner in these lifts of foundational clinical skills. On the other side of the coin, virtual patients offer an additional tool or platform for learning. Virtual patients addresses this desire to increase quantity and exposure to patient cases to students. This is also known as clinical variations. Virtual patients add to the general knowledge that a student can draw upon when confronted with a similar case, whether virtual or real, through pattern recognition. We know this with hands-on simulation and mannequins also. Virtual patients interactivity leverages the Kolben-Frey experiential learning theory in that by interacting with these virtual patients under certain conditions, it's expected that learning will be more efficient and more complete with a higher retention rate over more, say, passive education approaches. Virtual patients can provide students opportunities for self-directed learning, which leads to reflection, self-driven change, and of course, more insight into their performance. The gamification of learning motivates students to learn by using this like video game design theory and gaming elements in learning environments. And early virtual patient studies show technical aspects of communications, like what questions to ask can improve. So our first real definition of virtual patients, which I'm now going to call virtual patient 1.0, came of age between the 90s and the early 2000s. Since 2010, the number of studies including the term virtual patient has more than doubled by 2018 on the Medline database. And this is according to the Journal of Medical Internet Research. So why might we be seeing this resurgence of virtual patients? I know everybody's thinking it. How can you not think about it? I briefly touched on it a few slides back, so I'll just go ahead and say it. On a micro or single level event in 2020, COVID-19 has forced everything to be contactless, and education is no exception. COVID-19 has and continues to be an accelerator. It sent us all through this wormhole, kind of forcibly transporting us faster and further into a future that we couldn't have expected 7 months ago. Prior to COVID-19, it's interesting because institutional VR and AR committees were put together, and they were starting to explore more specifically virtual patients on VR platforms. VR platforms saw this huge adoption with technology being more mobile, et cetera. So these committees were put together, and initially they served primarily simply to gather information. But now in this COVID-19 world, they're being tasked with purchasing and implementing virtual simulation experiences for the immediate semester. And that's probably why so many of you joined today, is that you might be in that experience, or you might be having that experience where now you're being expected to, kind of pull the trigger on a various virtual virtual patient platform. So off topic, I do this tangents, if you will, humor me, please, off topic, but in the same vein, because I can't fit it anywhere else in my presentation. And I feel like it's really important to know and to share, is that with institutions moving rapidly toward hybrid learning and pivoting away from face-to-face, where and when possible, the popularity and widespread use of virtual patients has exponentially increased. This acceleration has two main benefits for the simulation community and virtual patient technology. First, COVID-19, an unforeseen event, is functioning actually as a catalyst for multimodal simulation, which is using multiple modalities to deliver identical or similar simulation experience. And here's my plug, my colleague, and also co-founder, CEO of PCS. He will host a specific learning lab on this topic of multimodal integration October 28th. Secondly, this COVID-19 event is pushing virtual patients through its own accelerated wormhole of development. More end users and widespread adoption often means faster advancement in a short period of time. These are very quick iteration cycles that we're experiencing. An example of this that we all have immediately experienced these last few months has been Zoom itself, the very platform that we're using right now, or Google Meet or Teams, other conferencing systems, etc. Daily Zoom users ballooned to more than 200 million in March from a previous maximum total of 10 million users. That's data from back in April. You can bet those software engineers at those companies, those cloud engineers, have been working 24/7 on their platforms during this time. It has pushed Zoom's functionality quickly, more so that it probably wouldn't have seen the same development if COVID-19 hadn't happened. So the most nimble of virtual patient platforms will see this accelerated development due to immediate need. Okay, let's get back on track. Why might we be seeing this resurgence of virtual patients on kind of a macro level? So before COVID was even a part of our lives, why are we seeing this resurgence now? I think it's for two main reasons. First, we've more clearly defined and categorized the various types of virtual patients that have emerged over the past 30 years, and the research helps a little bit too. The virtual patient is now recognized more as this umbrella term encompassing several types of virtual patients that exist on a variety of technology platforms, and they're used to address different competencies. There's an article titled "Virtual Patients, What Are We Talking About? A Framework to Classify the Meanings or the Meanings of the Term in Healthcare Education." It was published in 2015. It provides a really nice overview of these various platforms and competencies, which again, I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing this resurgence now. And it's important to note, I think, at this time, that not all virtual patients are created equal, nor should they be, because they're a tool in which we use for different competencies. Which takes us into part two. The specific advancements in technology that have allowed us to address some of the limitations that early virtual patients have, and now we move into, this is taking us into, with these technology advances, it's kind of taking us into this virtual patient 2.0. First, enhanced graphics and audio. We've got better digital rendering today. We've got more fluid animation today, smoother, more realistic voice synthesis. All of these contribute to a more realistic experience. So as the visuals evolved, which is important and it's good, the engine behind the virtual patient must also evolve into more, to complete that more engrossing and immersive interaction. That back end is known now as kind of this birth of modern natural language processing, or NLP. Through developments paved by Alexa and Siri and Cortana and Digital Assistant, Google Digital Assistant, natural language processing has given virtual patients this major push forward that it has needed. This is more of a leap towards that vision that a virtual patient is a human-like interaction, and it's made possible this ability to verbally question the virtual patient, so saying it out loud, who in turn provides a response guided by AI. There's no one but the AI kind of behind the screen, if you will. With these advancements, virtual patient platforms can stand on the shoulders of these tech giants and solve challenges frequently presented in previous decades research studies that said technology just wasn't there yet, both in terms of visuals and in terms of response rates. So today, under the virtual patient umbrella, there's a section of Canopy for virtual patients that use NLP, that use this natural language processing and artificial intelligence to address patient communication and clinical interviewing. Within these natural language processing and artificially intelligent virtual patients, the end user has the power of authorship over these patient cases, building personas and synthesizing responses without a degree in computer engineering, which was great news to me because I'm not a computer engineer by training. This customization of the virtual patient by the healthcare educator and simulationist can take virtual patients 2.0 to the next level. Clinicians and educators are really the only ones who can create realistic interactions with authentic patient responses and be better at, they're just better at predicting that communication branching that occurs during a clinical conversation. More on that in a minute. So part 3, how do virtual patients work? How exactly are the artificially intelligent virtual patients able to answer seemingly random, out of order learner questions? Well, they may use machine learning, and no one really knows how or why machine learning works. So that's the conclusion of the presentation today. Thank you. I'm just kidding. Don't leave. I'm just kidding. As we know from earlier in the presentation, there are several types of virtual patients, and it's difficult to know or tell which platforms might use NLP or components of AI. Tim Willett of Simulation Canada put together a terrific comprehensive list of virtual simulation platforms. I'm happy to share the link to this post lab. And while I can't speak to many of these platforms and how they work, I can speak to how simulators using the PCS Speech Engine, our platform, works. And I think that building believable personas, it helps to understand how something works. So that's what we're going to talk about next, how the PCS Speech Engine, how the PCS AI works. When a digital patient, when a PCS digital patient is asked a verbal question, these 5 components jump into action and work within milliseconds to give scenario appropriate and verbal answers. So let's take a simple learner introduction. Learner says, "Hello, Mrs. Smith. It's nice to see you. How can I help you today?" There we've got an intro. We've got maybe a statement. "It's nice to see you. How can I help you today?" The party starts when it has to differentiate, when the engine has to differentiate between human speech from other noises that might be in the background. And we use a neural network to detect voice activity. So the "Hello, Mrs. Smith" starts this 5-component process. Then Google steps in, and Google has the most advanced speech recognition services. They utilize neural networks, which are trained by billions of smartphone users every day, transcribing the entire introduction. So transcribing that entire "Hello, Mrs. Smith, it's nice to meet you. How can I help you today?" And that transcribes into the simulation log. Then the PCS grammatical analyzer and classifier, also driven by neural networks and trained on a rapidly growing data set of clinical interview questions, determines and assigns the question that is in need of answering. So the "How can I help you?" This is the question component. The AI needs to see that that's the question, and then of course answer the question. And it assigns that "How are you today?" might be a question eliciting chief concern or why the purpose of the visit. Then finally, when it comes to verbalizing that response, like, the patient says, the digital patient says, "I don't feel so well," neural network-based models have been the key to less machine sounding like voice synthesis. So we have this more smoother, natural sounding response. So every one of these components uses neural networks that are constantly being trained to improve their performance. And so this is how the PCS Speech Engine kind of works. And we will see an example of this here. So here we see those steps in action on the PCS platform within this simulation log. We also see here in the log, you can kind of see the addition of real-time assessment and scoring. So a question is asked, it's registered. If it's part of the objectives or the checklist, it's automatically checked off. So the stethoscope icon represents the learner, and the person icon is the patient. So the learner asks, "Does anything make them worse?" Patient replies, "Oh, well," the virtual patient or the digital patient recognizes the question. It then assigns it to kind of aggravating factor within its brain. And then of course it answers with the response that we've programmed. "Nothing makes it worse. I just have to get through it." The learner then asks, "Does anything make it better or anything make it better?" PCS digital patient replies, "Time, rest. I'll find a quiet, dark room until the headaches go away," or whatever we choose to write in that field. So to emphasize, while we're looking at this particular screenshot, I randomly selected this interview conducted at 9:15 p.m. Eastern using one of our free patients, and wanted to note that this conversation was, completely unscripted from the learner side. Reviewing some from logs, some from our free patients, we can kind of get a sense for questions and questions that are being asked and how the AI is responding. And so learners can ask their questions in any shape, any form, even in forms that have never been asked before, and the AI will match it to the most likely topic, given all the other questions that might be assigned to that topic. And of course, they can ask their questions in any order, even building on the context of previously asked questions. These spontaneous interviews is what I like to kind of call them. Mean realistic simulations happen relative to say, "Hey, pick from this list of questions and ask this," kind of interactions, which can sometimes feel very rigid and limit exploration and diagnostic thought process. So the PCS digital patient is only scripted in terms of patient responses, which leads us nicely into part 4. Building personas for virtual patients. Sir William Osler, frequently described as the father of modern medicine and one of 4 founding professors of Johns Hopkins Hospital, said, it's much more important to know what sort of patient has a disease than what sort of disease a patient has. It's with this concept that I approach building virtual AI personas, because after all, you can't always predict what a learner might ask in their quest to diagnose, or their quest to figure out what's going on with the patient. With that said, I do recommend having somewhat of a scenario in mind when you start. The patient scenario is called many different things: scenario, script, file, background document, tomato, it's all the same. It usually gives you a rough outline of the patient and the patient's purpose for needing medical attention, usually fitting into, of course, either the course itself or some objectives, some simulation objectives. It's often anywhere between 2 and 4 pages, depending on how thorough the author was or how in-depth the case is. This is a great place to start when building, of course, your digital patients. Pro tip: if you happen to have, or if you happen to be a simulation program that has a standardized patient educator, use that SP educator as a resource when building your persona. They're familiar with the clinical interview, they're familiar with training portrayal, they're familiar with healthcare medical education in that same clinical interview. So if you've got one, use one. And they're very creative as well. Next, consider all aspects of your virtual persona or patient beyond the present illness or chief complaint or purpose of visit. They're not just, say, a list of symptoms, if you will. What do they do? Is their job stressful? Could they be exposed to any hazards at work? What support systems do they have in their lives? Where do they live? Do they feel safe in their neighborhood? Is their house single story, or how many staircases might be in their home? Who do they live with, etc. The key is to think through the various layers that each of us has and how those layers might impact our health. And of course, more importantly, consider when you're building all the possible differential diagnoses. So pro insight: as a faculty member, you know that the abdominal pain scenario is appendicitis. However, your learners interviewing this patient would not know that. So it's important to build in or consider that when you're writing the responses and when you're determining what fields necessarily to fill out. So if your patient is female, or your digital patient is female, your avatar is female, you want to be sure to have answers programmed in for their gynecological history as well, to ensure that the learners can rule out, say, ectopic pregnancy, which presents somewhat similarly. So you want to have all your answers, of course, for your chief concern or your purpose of visit, but you also want to make sure you're mindful of all of these other diagnoses that the learners are going to explore as they rule out various diagnoses in their clinical reasoning process. To create, or rather customize, your patient persona, this is the PCS interface, the authoring interface, and it's broken down into these 3 panels within the patient authoring tool. The first panel is the main category. It's on the left-hand side. It has categories such as present illness, past medical history, family history, social history, review of systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then we see the next panel in the middle there, and that is the topic and response panel. And these are more specific topics within that category. And it includes a little line for you to type in what you want your patient to say when asked about that topic. The final panel there on the far right is a list of questions. So these are questions typically asked by the healthcare providers about the topic itself. So let's walk through what we see on the screen. And let's walk through specifically the example that we see on the screen. When a patient is asked, "Did you fall?" The patient then says, no falls. Once you've trained your virtual patient as to how you want them to respond, which is the no falls, the next part is to add any additional questions you might anticipate your learner asking. Like we see here, on the right-hand side in the example. Did you have any falls prior to this headache? They're trying to determine, of course, head injury and, of course, the headaches, and any sort of connection there. The question, did you have any falls prior to this headache? It looks different. You can see the different lettering. All the other questions are italics. This is the lettering in bold. And it includes keywords that are specific to this case. So what you see in italics, that's inherited. We kind of call it like inherited from the big AI brain, the big PCS AI brain. And the bold is local to this patient's brain. So we can anticipate, of course, the learners asking about this question, but if they then use like keywords, we want to make sure that those keyword questions, we kind of give these types of parameters to the AI for it to figure out and potentially assign to this topic. But that, again, don't worry if the question isn't located in this list word for word. That's okay. That's when the AI or the neural network steps in and finds kind of a likely match or a combination of match, and then it goes to, and then it's assigned to the topic. Pro tip, when building patient personas, you want to anticipate what questions the learners might ask specific to the patient and the responses you've programmed for them. So anything that you put into your response or as a patient response may trigger a follow-up question. This is what I like to call going 3 onion layers deep. You know, we're all onions, we have several layers to us. And so going through this exercise, this 3 onion layers deep exercise often leads to adding additional questions and either adding topics or ensuring your responses include the answers to their next question. It'll make sense in a minute when I provide this example. By doing this, strangely, it also builds rapport between learner and virtual patient by making the encounter feel less rehearsed or programmed and feel more real and spontaneous. So our example, a learner might say, "What's your occupation?" or "What do you do? What do you do for a living?" If you type in the response, "I'm a teacher," you might want to think, what would be your next question, or what would be the assumed next question that this learner might have? Well, they might say, "What grade do you teach?" And the AI, not being programmed to know that answer, might say, "I don't know," or "Can you repeat the question?" And then maybe there's another follow-up question. This third layer is, being a teacher stressful? Do you have a lot of stress at your job? So in this example, by going through this exercise, I might include the grade level itself into my occupation response. So when the learner asks, "What's your occupation? What do you do? What do you do for a living?" I've programmed in the response, I've written in the response, "I'm a 5th grade teacher." So that kind of answers that next question for them, or answers the next question that they might have followed up. And then by going through that exercise, I'm thinking one of the paths they might take is asking about stress, or stress being the job. So in that case, I would add in, excuse me, I would add into the topic column, stress, occupational stress, and then say in my question, "Is being a teacher stressful?" And then I would be able to have to program in my response. Yeah, sometimes dealing with the parents is more stressful than teaching the kids. And again, that is that second, third, sometimes even 4th layer that you want to go down to really make that patient encounter feel real when the learner is talking to them. Next, you want to determine if the scenario you created has any sort of, beyond the categories listed, has any sort of specialty screening that you want the PCS AI to listen for. For example, in this scenario, we've got a screening for medication adherence that's been added. Thus, we want our patient, our virtual patient, to listen for questions like, "Are you compliant with your medication? Do you always follow the directions of your medication?" and other forms of the question. Adding and customizing, adding these screenings, adding new categories, adding new topics, adding new questions is all very easy. You see it at the top, you simply click add question, type it in, add topic, type it in, add category, type it in. And that adds into the local patient that you're working on or the persona that you are working on. Pro tip, if there is a screening that is not currently within PCS, ask your friendly neighborhood head of content, AKA me, and we can work on it together. And if that content is, or that screening is in one patient, we can ensure that it's in other patients as well that you might be working on. So reach out to the PCS team for help and guidance when you need it. We are here, the content team, the advisory team, we're here to help. Once you've put in all your patient responses and you've made an attempt to anticipate the clinical conversational flow, you've done your 3-onion exercise, your 3-layer onion exercise, the final test is to QA your patient. Or interview your own patient before your learners interact with them or see them. Sometimes this can highlight responses that you might want to edit, or it can highlight maybe where there be persona holes, if you will, or conflicting information. So here are a few AI interview tips when you're testing. Interact with PCS AI as you would any human patient. Try to use good communication techniques. It's often what you teach your learners when talking to real patients, right? Speak naturally. Use a natural, normal pace, not too fast, not too slow. You'll want to pause after each question, listen for your digital patient's answer. You sometimes might want to be patient. And ask your question right after the patient's answer. Because sometimes if you jump into your next question too quickly, that Google transcript might not be intact. It might cut off, say, the first part of your question. So your patient's not really hearing your first few words. Use appropriate and strategical medical jargon. Use words that you would use with a human patient. If PCS didn't understand, then you simply rephrase the question. So for example, even though the AI is programmed to know this, if I said something like, does the pain radiate anywhere? Your patient may not understand what radiates mean. And so you might say, can you clarify, or I don't understand. Then you might choose another word. Does the pain travel anywhere? Does the pain spread anywhere? Does the pain shoot anywhere? Next, ask what I like to call good questions. Ask one question at a time. Try to avoid multiple or stacked questions. Again, we teach this in communication within healthcare education already. So incorrect use of questions may result in erroneous information or worse, omission of pertinent data. Like if you ask your digital patient or even your patient, do you drink, smoke, or use any recreational drugs? Your patient may admit to using one substance and omit the others. They might only answer what's legal versus what's illegal. So you really want to break down your questions one by one and try to avoid. The AI is just going to randomly pick one. It's going to find one question. It's going to randomly kind of answer that one. And I've noticed the trend is that often prompts learners to then ask the question again. So they might say, do you drink, smoke, or do drugs? And the AI will randomly be like, no, I don't smoke. Then that kind of prompts the learner to then say, what about alcohol? Do you use alcohol? Do you drink? Questions like that. Another probably a good AI tip, communication tip would be avoiding leading questions. Leading questions tend to supply a particular answer for the patient. So try to avoid questions like that. The AI does okay with some leading questions, but others, it's better to ask those direct questions. So those leading questions like, you've never had anything before like this, right? A better question might be, have you had anything like this before? Next, be mindful of follow-up questions containing pronouns. So AI and neural networks aren't yet on par with the human brain, which is good for anybody scared of the singularity. So when it comes to understanding conversational context, The human mind far surpasses AI. So when you are asking follow-up questions that use the same subject as the previous question, kind of be mindful that you might have to repeat your question or clarify your question. For example, we often see this with medications. The learner will ask, are you taking any medications? Which kind of assumes, is it prescription or non-prescription? But the virtual patient will pick one and will say, I take Tylenol sometimes, like when I have a headache. The learner then will ask the follow-up question, how often is that? How often does that happen? I'm using that in both questions. How often does that happen? That's kind of gets into some gray area with the AI, and the answer might not be what it selects might not be what you had intended. So a better question might be, and we talk to learners about this as well prior to their first digital patient encounter on PCS. We say a better question might be, how often do you take Tylenol? Or maybe a better first question that I just mentioned, are you taking any over-the-counter medications? Yes, I take Tylenol sometimes when I have a headache. How often are you taking a Tylenol? So that's kind of a more clear, direct way of speaking and could be beneficial to patients as well. Finally, pro tip, parroting. So when you're testing, when you're interviewing your own patient, when you're performing quality assurance, parrot. Repeat back to your virtual patients the words that they use or the words that you've kind of programmed them to use. Your learners will parrot, and that's good. That's good that they've been properly trained to use the patient's language, sometimes to clarify or back to them. So, for example, we had one scenario. Learner asked, "What brings you in today?" The digital patient replies, "My periods have been really erratic." Follow-up question, what do you mean by erratic? Can you tell me what erratic means to you, etc.? And then with that question comes, they've been really irregular since I've stopped taking birth control pills or something like that. So this is an example of when you're in testing, if you've missed something in your 3 onion layer exercise, when you can pare it back, this is when you can kind of find any sort of, blind spots from your authoring. So with that last pro tip that I provided, our final, I might have also been shopping online during this presentation summary. You know who I'm looking at you, you know who you are. The virtual patient 2.0 is here and it's artificially intelligent, largely thanks to our phone's digital assistants and of course other recent technology advancements on both the hardware side and the software side. Virtual patients use are becoming more mainstream because of COVID's immediate pressure and need, but it's also something we've been working towards with classification and research. So with greater understandings comes, of course, greater usage. Building virtual personas really does, and I've seen this firsthand, increase the effectiveness of the tool by allowing for more convincing interactions. It's more immersive. The suspension of disbelief is held pretty tightly. When you have these personas, these digital people that can answer several layers into the question that the learner is asking spontaneously and randomly. So what questions do you have? And if you're uncomfortable asking a question here in this forum, or you're listening to a recording of this learning lab, you can email me or you can email the team with your questions, and Nick is happy to answer any of those questions as well, or even set up if you prefer to have kind of a one-on-one experience. So what questions I'm opening up to you callers. What questions do you have for me? Here we go, I'm opening up the chat. Okay, question. Can you set up a patient to do a teach back session? A teach back session. Is this more in the sense of like a feedback session, where the patient is then providing feedback, like you ask several multiple questions, or a better way to phrase that would be something like that. I would say feedback in the form of the auto assessment, that's probably the immediate feedback. So did you ask this? Did you ask this? Yes, no, here's, kind of your percentage for the various, components of the checklist. So in that way, feedback. I don't know if we're ready yet, or the platform is really ready yet to provide the type of feedback that you would really benefit, or your students would really benefit from a standardized patient. So using the virtual patients kind of as a bridge to standardized patients that can provide that feedback, if you're fortunate enough to have that type of program.
Teach back would actually be like you taught the patient to maybe give themselves insulin, and they could show you that they could do that skill, or whatever or that they understood their discharge instructions.
Interesting. That might be an offline conversation, Kimberly, that we can have. You could set up the kind of the categories or topics for that. If there's like a patient education mode, the learner says, this is how you do something, and then asks the patient, can you summarize back to me what I told you? In that way, yes, I think that could be possible. It's not something we've explored as of yet. We're trying to really increase success rates or response rates, so that, say out of 10 questions, 9 of them are answered spot on. But that's a great question, Kimberly.
I didn't ask the original question. I was just clarifying what teach back was. So
thank you, Kimberly.
I'm not sure who it was.
Got it. Grace has a question. How long has your company been in business? We first started before virtual platforms were really ready. We first started at PCS about 5 years ago, working with NASCO or Simulades, building this type of functionality into mannequins. So if you might have heard of Alex has this kind of this AI brain in him. And then once we saw with Oculus, once we saw virtual patient or virtual reality platforms really become stable and really become reliable, that's when about 2 years ago in 2017 at IMSH, we launched PCS Spark. Thank you, compliment. It's amazing work. It is a lot of work, but once you build your patient with some, maybe some maintenance, for example, if you add a category to another patient, it affects this patient on this side. Those patients, those personas live in the system and can be accessed 24/7 for several years. So it's a lot of work, but I feel that it's worthwhile. It's a worthwhile investment. How many students have utilized this platform? We have several institutions that are using this, from PA programs to nurse practitioner programs to schools of medicine. And they, of course, have varying degrees of number of students. In fact, there's a university, their College of Pharmacy is actually doing an event this week. They'll see one patient this week, and they have kind of open access to practice, and they can interview as many times as they want. And then next week, they'll have more of an assessment that happens on a particular day. Nick might be a better person to answer this question. I mean, I think we're into the, 4-digit number of students.
The thousands?
Yeah, thousands. So thousands of students are currently using this platform. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but the session that we saw earlier that I took a screenshot of, that happened at 9:15 at night Eastern time. So students can really go in, and it's interesting with our free, with the patients that you can access for free, and anybody can, learners included. They go in at all times of the day, and I think it helps with their kind of brain to mouth muscle memory, asking the questions out loud. It's a judgment-free zone. And then they go into, say, seeing, standardized patients, maybe even virtually now. The next question, can you do psychomotor skills on the platform, and how? So psychomotor skills in the sense of physical exam skills, you can do auscultation, you can do pulses, you can like look into the eyes, which then displays an image. So we're pulling in parts of those elements and we continue to iterate on those. I think that we started out with just auscultation. Now you can do several other physical exam functionality, in addition to like ordering labs, for example, or ordering diagnostic tests. You see kind of a list, and you click, oh, I'd like to get a CT scan, and then you see the results.
I'm sorry, Michelle, like doing a dressing for nursing students or something like that. Could they do that?
Great question, Lisa, and I'm glad you clarified psychomotor skills. So not yet, but that's something that we want to continue to develop, its interactivity. We're also, with virtual reality, we're also waiting for like haptics to be better, to be more advanced. I certainly see that within the next couple of years, so that you could maybe even feel or do the dressing. But until then, we'll operate in the in this virtual space, either in the headset or interviewing via your computer. So we're not quite there yet, to answer your question. Thank you for clarifying. Another question, I find that students often get lost in the weeds and go down rabbit holes while asking questions, and that's not often given, and this is not often given as feedback. With the simulations, you see an entire transcript of what that student was, what the student asked, how the AI responded, how it answered, etc. So there is a certain layer that if you're getting to like the 7th layer onion, it says, I don't know if that's relevant for our interview, or I don't think that's relevant today. So the system, there are sections that will start to push back, almost as like bowling alley guide rails that keep the students kind of on track. If they also don't answer, or if the AI doesn't answer, that might be a great clue for them to get back on track with their clinical interview. So yes, they do sometimes go down these holes, and that's why, again, clinicians, educators, simulationists, we kind of know what those guardrails should be. Like, sure, it's important to ask about stress in the workplace, but is it important to, to ask the number of meetings that they've had every day? Well, maybe if it's a headache and there's the computer screen that's causing visual disturbances, but we know we can kind of set those guardrails up within the system. Another question is, what systems go into building up the graphical interface and NLP? For example, patient shows dislike about a particular question. Great question. And I didn't talk about it in the presentation because I know that I'm limited in time and I can go on and on. So we can build in, we put them in brackets, we can build in pauses. This is helpful with patients with respiratory issues. It can be frustrating for learners because they have to wait through, but that's realistic, where a patient can only maybe say 3 words at a time and then pause. We can also put in coughs, and this is all programming that you do, that I do when we're building these personas. We can do nods, we can do head shakes, and we can do these, of course, together. So we can start off our response with bracket, nod, end bracket, and say, yes, I've been having this pain for several days now. So you can program in happy, where their expressions are a bit cheery. You can program in kind of looking sick, so their faces become a bit more pale, their avatar faces become more pale, and there's a list of other ones as well. And we're continuing to expand those. Ones that we want to expand to are, classic nonverbal skills, like, or nonverbal cues, like crossing of the arms, being able to put that in when, as you mentioned, shows dislike for a particular question or an uncomfortable question. Another question, is there a limit to the number of question branches that can be installed into a scenario? Absolutely not. You can add as many questions, as many topics, as many categories as you want. Good question. Where can we check out the free patients? I think it's pcs.ai/free. Oh, okay. Okay.
Sorry.
/free. Yeah. Free patients, great. Great. Thank you, Nick. And last question, are there facial expressions that cue a learner that the question is not relevant to that interview? Puzzled, head cocked.
There is one for surprise.
Yeah, there is one for surprised. And so that can be a question. It's really interesting. Some of the free patients, we've seen students go in, and even though the patient's male, they will ask, and I think it's because they must be practicing for maybe an OBGYN exam, but they'll ask that male patient, when was your last menstrual period? Can you describe, can you tell me about the flow? Questions like that. And the patient at the moment just says, I was born a natal male, things like that. But you can puzzle, you can put in that surprise kind of look as well. So we're always expanding in terms of facial features and these types of things that we can do for that, kind of nonverbal cue. So all really great questions. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. I know with back-to-back Zoom meetings these days, it's really, it's an honor that you attended my session. So thank you very much. Please reach out if you have any questions, and we're happy to answer those. We're excited about answering those ones. That's sometimes we use that as inspiration for product roadmaps. I will be talking to Nick and the CEO about what can we do in terms of psychomotor skills. How do we move those chains forward to meet this particular educational need? The question even earlier about a teach back session. So all of these are great ideas that we, again, want to be nimble. We want to take COVID as an opportunity to push development and push it fast. So I say to the engineers that the beatings will continue until morale improves. No, I'm just kidding. One last question. It seems, do you have any baby patients, particularly NICU babies? So great question. Really great question. Not yet. Right now, what we do have though is a pediatric, we have a pediatric avatar that also has a childlike voice, but we also have it now, and it's, I think next week or maybe the week after, we're going to be presenting at a pediatric simulation conference. And so we're gonna have the child, the 8-year-old pediatric in the bed, and the mother avatar sitting next to the bed. And when you ask a question, both the mother and the child can both answer. They can take turns answering, etc. So that's going to be really exciting because, again, we want to address this need where the avatar, there are two avatars, and one is the patient that is unresponsive, can't talk, might be NICU, and then the other one is a parent or maybe a translator or maybe a health advocate. Ed, I will definitely say hello to Balaj for you. I hope you're doing okay in California with all the fires and everything. Another question, do you have Spanish speaking patients? No, this is a complicated answer. We can chat about it offline. So you can type in, your patients can respond to an English question in Spanish. And we also, I think in the future, will look to our Spanish speaking users to kind of help build this back end or help build this kind of question bank in Spanish. Dave, with your question about Canadian sites currently using the product, I don't think there are any Spark users, but there are several Alex users, which again, Alex is a mannequin with the PCS AI brain that are using Alex and do, talk to Alex and the mannequin. So yes, Canadian sites are using Alex, but not yet Spark virtually. and other languages, so Spanish, and then I think French. Those I think, and I think there might be another one that is in the roadmap to develop into development and bring it up to the level that we have on English. So 12:02. Thank you again very much. Let's see, I don't know how many people are left, but if there are any questions, reach out to us. Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe, physically, psychologically, and we'll see you at the next Learning Lab, October 28th, multimodality. They'll talk about Alex in that session as well. So Alex and Spark and a PCS shirt, or PCS Plus as it's also known.